Okay, we have a webcast for Unit 2, SI number 8. With George Washington stepping down after his second term, creating an impressive precedent for all other presidents to follow in his footsteps, we have a new election. And with that election, John Adams is selected with the majority of Electoral College votes, which sets up this topic number 8. We're going to take a look at John Adams and some of the key moments of his administrative history. One of the prominent things that we have to make sense of is this divided executive. So remember, as the Constitution outlines and designs, the Electoral College selects the president. Each elector from each state casts 2 votes. This is the original design. It's not the way it works today, because the Constitution will be amended and this process that I'm describing will have been replaced. But as originally designed, each elector casts 2 votes, because you're really casting a vote for a field of candidates, and the candidate that gets the most votes becomes president, and the candidate that gets the second most votes becomes vice president. And here in this 1796 presidential election, you have John Adams received 71 electoral votes. This makes a lot of sense, actually. He's a prominent founding father, as I said, Continental Congress delegate, part of the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence, represented the United States in Europe as an ambassador even during the war years. He was the nation's first vice president. So there's plenty of experience and credibility that John Adams has as a candidate for presidency. Of course, some of those same credentials apply to Thomas Jefferson, and you can see there he gets 68 electoral votes himself, so narrowly losing out the presidency to John Adams. The problem with all this is they come from 2 different parties. Parties didn't exist in the first presidential election, but they certainly do exist by 1796. The Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, 2 opposing political parties with different visions and policy initiatives that they want to sponsor and support. So what does this mean? You have an executive branch that has a president and a vice president that represent completely different visions for the country. Everybody saw this as problematic because of the difference of opinions between Adams and Jefferson, and certainly there's this danger of division because of the differences. We even see this from a sectional point of view, with John Adams being from the north and Jefferson representing the Virginian South, and so what's going to happen with this country? Is this country going to be able to survive 2 executive officers with such opposing viewpoints? One of the things that happens in the administration is the Xyz Affair, and we kind of go backwards to be able to go forwards here. So we reviewed Jay's Treaty. This was a treaty under George Washington's administration. Remember, John Jay negotiated a very unpopular treaty with Great Britain. So that all of that unpopularity of Jay and Jay's Treaty and the anti-British sentiment kind of comes into the mix here with this Xyz Affair. So we have continuing conflict in Europe between the Brits and France. The Jay's Treaty kind of signs on with an exclusive deal trading with Great Britain, which certainly doesn't make France very happy, particularly in the context of France helping us in the American Revolution, securing independence. And now they feel a bit betrayed due to Jay's Treaty. So just like the British were doing to us, and seizing ships and sailors and cargo, which caused the need for Jay's Treaty. Now the French are doing the same. And because of this conflict in the open waters and kind of violating American neutrality as well as American shipping and trading, uh, John Adams sends Charles Pinckney, John Marshall, and Elbridge Gerry, prominent men in their day, on a diplomatic mission to try to settle this dispute and this conflict with France. Now, you would think when we send diplomats to a country that they would be received by the equal level of diplomats, which in this case would be the French Foreign Minister Charles Talleyrand. Um, but what ended up happening is lower level French the ministers in the government, and we don't have their names here because they were codenamed XYZ, basically took an audience with these three American diplomats and bribed them. Said, if you want to be able to speak and negotiate with the foreign minister Talleyrand, then you need to pay us money, all right? And this whole bribing scenario very much backfired on France. When word came back to the United States that this is the way that our three delegates, diplomatic delegates, were being treated, it really ignited now an anti-French sentiment because of the lack of protocol in which our guys were treated and a lack of respect. So that all kind of trickles out into, you know, a war with France that's really not declared. So, in all intents and purposes, out in the Atlantic, we have some seafaring warfare, but we're not officially at war. And what happens here is it just creates crazy chaos between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Democratic Republicans have always favored a relationship with France. And so now that we've become hostile to France and have this pseudo war, which the Federalists supported, um, there was a lot of bickering, infighting, finger pointing, accusations, and so forth. You can see in this sketch just people kind of being demonstrated, displayed out of control, you know, even violent in nature in terms of body position and waving canes and so forth. So, what does this all mean? John Adams is a Federalist. He takes the Federalist side, which angers his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, who's taken the, the French position to try to reconcile with the French and, be able to work on that relationship. So, one of the things that happens here, and this is entirely John Adams' fault, because Congress is also involved, is that we have a passage of some laws called the Alien Acts and the Sedition Acts. And what ended up happening with these acts, you see the Alien Acts kind of defined how a foreign-born immigrant could become a citizen of the United States. So it extended the amount of time that they had to be residents before they could be citizens. Basically, this was being pointed towards anybody of French immigration. Since there was an anti-French sentiment, we wanted to keep French people immigrating to the United States from becoming citizens. And the other element of the Sedition Acts was that the government, the power of the federal government, could begin to monitor, arrest, silence anybody, individual or group, could be like a newspaper, who was beginning to criticize the government policy, which of course would be the Federalist policy. It's a Federalist president, and even Congress was dominated by Federalists at this time. When the Sedition Acts were passed, a firestorm broke out, particularly sponsored by the Democratic Republicans, Thomas Jefferson and the others, who said the Sedition Acts are hostile to the First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom assembly. And so this created a crazy division, right? Very intense political struggle between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. This created a movement of Democratic Republican politicians and states who had a dominant number of Democratic Republican support to propose this idea of nullification. So Thomas Jefferson and James Madison kind of lead the charge. You can see here JM is James Madison, so he's going to be representing his home state of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson started representing Kentucky, new state in the Union, and basically started drafting papers providing these states kind of the argument for the right for nullification, which meant that a state could nullify an act of Congress. Well, that is a brand new idea here, all right? According to the Constitution, the only entity that can nullify an act of Congress and make it null and void or make it unconstitutional would be the Supreme Court. And so now these state resolutions promoting state nullification powers is really testing federal separation of powers or adding another layer onto it. So do we need nullification? Or does federalism, checks and balances, and separation of powers work by itself? Certainly these states that are sponsoring nullification theory are really strong states' rights minded, which is kind of going back to Articles of Confederation, states' rights mindedness. These states are believing that another layer of protection of states' rights, which would be to nullify an act of Congress that they thought might limit the freedoms and rights of states, was necessary. So watch for the nullification term to kind of play out for the rest of our history. So it pretty much becomes a moot point. Nullification kind of dies away, but we see it introduced here as a concept that states have the power to make a law of Congress unconstitutional. We do have a settlement in France with this convention in 1800. So the tensions between France and the United States begin to settle down and return to some type of normalcy. Court packing scheme. John Adams will lose his effort to be reelected to a second term. And so what happens, he's going to be an outgoing president. Well, who won that presidential election? His vice president, Thomas Jefferson, will become the next president. And even though Thomas Jefferson is elected president, he doesn't become president immediately. There's a period of time in which he's the president-elect. In that intermediary time, as John Adams is finishing his term, he begins to appoint 42 judges to various court positions in the federal government. And what he's trying to do here is he's trying to add new justices from the Federalist political perspective, knowing that the incoming president, his rival, Thomas Jefferson, is a Democratic Republican. And so therefore having a strong judiciary full of Federalist-minded judges, they would be able to offset any new legislation that the Democratic Republicans with the Jefferson administration might author and try to put into motion. So they're trying to prevent Democratic Republican reforms. And of course, this because this is controversial, and this will also become an element of Jefferson's administration that he's going to have to contend with. And so we'll see this story continue on later in another SI. To finish here, I want to characterize John Adams and Thomas Jefferson's relationship. Remember, they were the foremost voices of independence in the Continental Congress in the Revolutionary days. They both were in the committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. They worked together. They knew each other. But over time, particularly as political parties started to take shape, they took different sides. And as they took different sides, it became very hostile to their personal relationship, which at one time was quite good, um, an admiring friendship, but now strained and fractured. So you can kind of see what certain voices said about each of these characters. Republican, Democratic, Republican sponsored newspapers criticized John Adams of being an aristocrat, trying to link him to like wealthy British noble classes. Certainly wanted to peg him as somebody who wanted more power at the federal level at the expense of states and civil rights. And they also claimed that he was a secret monarchist. On the other side, you have Federalist newspapers that would claim Thomas Jefferson was a dangerous radical and was even an atheist, showcasing um, his not belief in Jesus as divine and not the savior of the world, not being supernatural and possessing the power of miracles. And so you can see that both sides really finger point and kind of smear the other side. And in some cases, Adams and Jefferson are even responsible for some of these smear campaigns, kind of encouraging it and maybe even directing it. Certainly that's true of Thomas Jefferson. And so this ruined their friendship. They just really became distant. And years later, as they grew older, outside of politics, they will reconcile. And believe it or not, they both die on the same exact day, which was July 4th. We'll get to that story later. But for the time, what once was a admiring, good relationship is fractured and wounded. So there you go. The SI number 8 overview.